I welcomed you on the show a couple of years ago for Black Swan, which was my favorite film that year. So I'm so excited to have an opportunity to speak to you again. I guess to start out with, since we're here to talk, the stage is kind of the upcoming event, Bobby, that you're moderating with Andy. Can you give us a sense of what kind of films that you're going to cover during that event?
We're going to focus on Andrew's work with the two directors that I think provide a golden opportunity for comparison and contrasting, which is Darren Aronofsky and Wes Anderson. And we're going to actually show clips from all the films that Andrew did with those directors, which is basically Moonrise Kingdom and Fantastic Mr. Fox and Darjeeling Limited with Wes Anderson, and Black Swan and The Wrestler with Darren Aronofsky.
Wow. Well, Andrew, as a viewer, the films of Wes Anderson and Darren Aronofsky are very different in tone, but do they have similarities in terms of your working relationship with them?
I'm not sure about my working relationship with them. I mean, that there are similarities. There is similarities in them as filmmakers that may not be obvious when you just look at the films alone, because their tones are so different and the subject matters are so different. But they're both, independent voices in American film that kind of surfaced around the same time, and they've had different trajectories, but they're independent filmmakers with a lot of control over their projects. But how they work can have there are a lot of contrasts, a lot of differences between the two, which I think I said the other day. It's a bit like exercising different muscle groups on different films, but they're definitely different filmmakers.
I mean, it must be, because under any kind of circumstances, whether you're a writer or a cinematographer or a composer, you kind of have to meld your own process to be complementary to the director you're working with. So when you say they're like flexing different muscles, I mean, what do you feel that, say, for instance, Wes Anderson, how do you feel that he challenges you that's different from Aronofsky?
Well, it's all about how we approach the editing process, how we start our attack on the film and figuring out how to put it together. Both of them are very involved in all the details. What they expect from me as a contributor or as a collaborator kind of happens at different stages in the process. Whereas it's very important to Darren to see my assembly and my take on things first before we really start digging in and exploring together. Wes prefers to see that after he gets a shot himself with me. So, that just starts the dialogue out in a very different way. That's a fundamental difference, I guess.
Well, it's interesting, too, because I know the last film that you did with Wes Anderson, the Moonrise Kingdom, you were actually editing on location. So did you have an assembly of something they shot the day before? I mean, was it that quick of a turnaround?
Well, we worked pretty closely on location together. I think it wasn't so. I was on set, but it wasn't so much about my cutting on the set as much as just being there as a sounding board or someone to talk to about what he was getting and what the options were on the day. I did almost nothing editorially on set, but okay. I was available to talk about things. And then in the evenings we would get together and look at things and kind of roughly slap them together and make sure they were in the ballpark. With Darren, that's different. There are definitely days where I would specifically cut scenes on the day while we were shooting them at lunch or what have you. We would look at them together and make sure that things were covered just by looking at them.
Is that because of a time element, or because I've heard a lot of times directors say that they're grateful to have some sort of distance between the shooting of the movie and the editing of the movie because they're able to look at it with fresh eyes. But with scheduling, with release dates and that sort of thing, is it becoming less and less common to have that time to ponder?
No, that's not really what it's about. It's usually specifically, it's about specific issues on the day or during the shoot. Let's say we know we only have a certain number of days or a day at a location or with an actor or what have you, whatever the time crunch is of that specific thing. It's an extra level of security for the director to be able to quickly review that we have what we need for that thing, but it doesn't become a global approach to the shoot of the movie, or else that could pretty quickly become a distraction from getting your day done, sitting there trying to make the edit work in the moment.
I mean, a really good example of that is on The Wrestler, because you said you needed to be there when they were shooting the wrestling scenes, because that was a very specific issue of coverage. And
Exactly. It was a situation where we were basically shooting at live wrestling matches that were put together for the film, but if we needed something else, we weren't going to find an extra day in our budget to put together and have a wrestling match where 500 people show up. It doesn't work like that. So we had to make sure you got it that day, especially with our budget, because there was no way to go back. So we played with it almost like a live event. And that was true for the matches, but not for the rest of the movie, clearly. And a similar approach to the ballet sequences in Swan.
Whereas Fantastic Mr. Fox was an extreme of the director and editor working together constantly during shooting because of the nature of that production.
Well, I mean, I don't know how they work in each of their films, but I would imagine that Fantastic Mr. Fox must have been different too, because you had to storyboard that movie to death, I would think, to know exactly what.
Well, there's a full animatic put together of the whole feature, which is animated storyboards basically. Every moment is worked out before they even start animating. So that gets revised constantly during the shooting process as you're fitting in animated shots and making sure they fall into place.
What's really interesting when I talked to Andrew was that not only are these directors very different, they have a very different way of working, but there's an evolution within their careers with Andrew that changed too, and the whole nature of trust and shorthand and all those wonderful things that happen in the marriage of an editor and director, as there is a comfort level that develops over different the progression of different films. You see that in evidence in terms of not only how much Andrew was on the set, but just in terms of the nature of their working together too, and the nature of the films. Andrew talked at length about how working on Fantastic Mr. Fox changed the way Wes Anderson shot and edited his films and the way he worked both on set and with Andrew. So, that's also interesting that they grew together and they both learned with each other, which is a beautiful thing that can happen when you have a long-time collaboration with a director as an editor.
Are you aware, Andrew? I mean, when you look at the scope of your career, do you see a kind of maturation? I mean, do you see how you've matured from where you started, and how would you define that?
Well, I think there's a different degree of confidence now than I've ever had before, that I had when I started, and that's just obvious that, you're not so worried about if this is going to be exactly right or exactly wrong, and you're more comfortable just trying things and exploring things, especially when it's not the first time you're working with the given filmmaker or the director, that you feel freer to experiment because you understand their tastes and you understand their aesthetic a little bit more, or your aesthetic with them together. And often, they'll have ideas where they know certain things that I'm going to like or not like. We inform each other with that stuff. So it does evolve into a certain language that you have with these people when you work with them, with any filmmaker really, even just in the microcosm of just working on any given film, even if it's just for one film with the director, you get to know each other and you get to understand each other's, I don't want to say agendas, but your visions and your tastes and your opinions.
Do you find that your general feeling for story has evolved as well?
Yeah, I think that narrative is pretty important to both of these filmmakers, and to me in general. I've taken that with me when I've worked on other projects to try and attack point of view in the film to figure out what's working, what isn't working about it, or the storytelling. That's always been important to me as a viewer, as somebody who's just a film fan, is that whether I'm getting lost in the story or not. And that's part of the dialogue all the time in the cutting room, whether we're telling the story the way we should be.
In terms of story and character, what do you need to understand about a scene before you start to cut it?
Well, you have to understand what the point of the scene is in the overall film. And once the scene is over, what's different about the story. Where I often talk about tracking your main character and understanding their point of view, meaning their position or opinion or reaction to whatever just happened. And if you don't understand that at the end of the scene, then the scene isn't working fundamentally. I mean, that's just a general rule. That you want to understand where your main character is, assuming it's a singular main character, but whoever the main character is of the scene that you're supposed to be identifying with on some level, or experiencing it through on some level. You have to understand what they think about what just happened, and or what's just been said, or what's been exposed. Whatever it is, every scene has that aspect to it, or else it's just shoe leather. And you're not furthering the story through the characters.
And in terms of options, having a lot of options at your disposal to kind of define the truths of a scene, do Mr. Anderson and Mr. Aronofsky, do they shoot a lot of coverage? I mean, do they give you a lot of options to work with?
Well, Wes doesn't shoot a lot of coverage. He's pretty particular about getting it right on the day a lot of the times. I mean, that there are exceptions to every rule, but quite often he'll use blocking and certain other things on the set and performance on the day to help know that he has what he needs and that it's telling the story, and so that it's less obvious how you can reshape it later on. Although we've definitely flipped things on their heads in the editing process, but it's not shot to manipulate often. But there will be scenes where it's just a conversation of two people at a dinner table or two people sitting and talking or whatever it is, where he knows that the performance is going to need to be shaped and he'll cover it accordingly. But Darren almost always shoots coverage and options to push performances or meaning one way or the other. Unless there's just one specific shot in the scene that has a specific story point. I mean, there are exceptions again, but he's more likely to get options and coverage than Wes is.
Well, I would think, especially for something like Black Swan, which feels so bold and experimental. I'm sure you guys went through several versions of various moments.
Yeah, there were a handful of moments where we vacillated, went back and forth on a lot of different choices, but the path we wanted to take and what we wanted to do with the character was always clear. It was just a question of modulating it and what certain moments and certain scenes and the order that they came in actually meant. We talked a lot about Nina's character in that film in terms of success and failure, and because we decided somewhere along the way that she always viewed things in terms of whether she was going to succeed and become the Swan Queen or not. Yeah. And every scene was kind of measured with that idea in mind, and there was probably more there were probably more moments in the film where you thought maybe she had some more success along the way, or got encouragement from Leroy or other things, and we realized that every time we pulled that stuff out and just kept it more of a downward spiral for her, the more tension there was in the film. So, we always looked at it like that. And sometimes there were scenes that were meant to be more of an encouragement or more positive in the script, and we recut them to make them imply that she had failed at something.
Yeah, and I'm sure rhythm has a lot to do with kind of setting those tones too. And it's interesting because we're in the process in the middle of a 2-week series now where we're interviewing a lot of film composers, and with a couple of them we have talked about the editing process and how that fits in with what they do, and some of them have said, sometimes we can point out kind of deficiencies in the rhythm of the edit based on the music we provide. And,
right.
And I'm curious, for you as an editor, how do you work with score, and what does that do for your process?
Well, I work with. I like to leave. My personal preference is to leave score out of the equation for as long as possible. And the reason for that is when you stick a piece of co-opted, temporary music onto a scene, it just applies whatever emotion that music was going after in the first place, and it sometimes is misleading in terms of what the intent of the scene is, or whether the scene is even working. So if you stick a piece of temp music on something that kind of smooths over the rough edges or the problem or whatever's not quite landing in the scene, but it works just enough that it gets you by, and then when the time comes to compose a score for the film in whatever idiom or language you're using for the score for the film, and then suddenly that moment doesn't work the way the temp score did, and you have temp love, which happens all the time, then you can't fix the moment anymore because you haven't worked on it editorially. So I always try to think of, just on the most fundamental level, often I cut without any track playing, any audio at all, depending on what the scene is. If it's just dialogue, I'm not going to do that. But if it's an internal dialogue, I'll cut without any sound at all and just make sure the picture's working. Because if the picture's working, then everything else either just supports it or doesn't. And that includes the audio and the dialogue and the sound effects and the music and so on. It's all just an enhancement instead of a Band-Aid. That's just an important strategy. If I talk about Darren's music, the music in Darren's films, he never uses temp score at all. We will never use it. We will never take music from another composer or another film. Butler, we had none, and Clint wrote music for the film late in the process, and there's very little score, and we only used it where we needed it. And then there was some source music that was throughout the film. For Black Swan, it was all obviously Tchaikovsky related.
Right.
And everything. So there was a vocabulary there anyway, and it was never really temp. It just got built on by Clint and reorchestrated, and he enhanced it in different ways. Wes is very different. He often conceives of what music he wants to use for certain moments based on what he was listening to when he wrote it, or whether. And a lot of times, that preconception comes before I'm even involved. But there's still room for it to change. But his collaboration with the composer is very different than Darren's is. I can't really speak too much about that because I'm not the composer. That's not my collaboration. But how it informs the editing process. Sometimes we will cut a scene to a very specific piece of music with Wes, and then we cut the music to make it work the picture and back and forth. But at least we have this template.
Something you just said actually reminded me of some teachings that I was talking one time about the critic Pauline Kael, and she was talking about something that she was taught, which is if you turn down the volume on a film, and you can still understand exactly where the story's going, then that's an example of a really well-cut film.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's fascinating to me. Yeah.
It's hard to undo that if it's working. You can't. You can only make it better from that point. So.
Yeah. So, Bobby, when you look through Andrew's work, what's been the most surprising or delightful observation that you've made?
Well, I think I'm always impressed with an editor's ability to, first of all, go into an entirely new country and be very sensitive to the vision of the director, the particular way they're working, to leave your ego at the door and really have all your antenna out and really be sensitive to what I love. At one point, Andrew said, he was talking about the cutting room being a very sensitive environment, and that you have to remember at the core of all this that, you're ultimately trying to help the director find their film. And I think they are unusually different, these two directors. If you just took two random directors and put them together, you wouldn't necessarily find this difference. And I find his ability to morph into their world and really find the best and always, I think his trajectory is really interesting too, that he was in the film world before the digital world, and he was exposed to all the wonderful mentorship that comes from and values that come from that. And then he was a visual effects editor after being an assistant editor rather than going right to film. So I feel like Andrew has sort of the best of both digital and film in terms of his ability to be very creative and think outside the box, and yet he, stick to the rules when they're working. And what's interesting about these two directors is they come from very different backgrounds in terms of their film education, and it informs their work. That Darren Aronofsky is very much has this rule book and has a very sort of classic way of covering a scene. It's not that he won't try other things, but and that Wes Anderson has, he was a philosophy major, and then in college, and he absorbed film sort of, by osmosis, but he approaches it in a very different way, and even the way they collaborate, the fact that Andrew puts the film in an assembly for Aronofsky, and then they watch the entire film in daily form after he's edited it. And with Wes Anderson, they're editing together, and Wes Anderson is discovering how the film comes together with Andrew. So it's an entirely different way of working. So I just think that I'm not only is he very articulate about his process, but he's incredibly creative and sensitive at the same time. And it just comes out when you start talking about these films with him, and the two different directors. I just think it brings it all to the surface.
Yeah, I had a question actually related to the close-up, because we were talking about a critically acclaimed movie a couple of weeks ago, and one of our co-hosts said, there's too many close-ups in that movie. You don't get a bearing on the geography of the scene, and that started to get me thinking. The close-up must be, in one way, an editor's ultimate weapon, but in another way, if you overuse it, it can really throw off a scene, I would think.
Well, it's important to make a decision about when you go close and why you go close, or when you go wide and why you go wide. When you reveal something about the space, and what the right time is, what it means at different points in the scene. I mean, it's instinctive to always try and start the scene with some establishing shot or a wide shot, because that's just the language we're all comfortable with. It sets the stage, but often it's more powerful to not do that. Start close and go wide, and because there's something else about the space that informs what's happening later in the scene.
And these two directors have different opinions about close-ups, don't they?
No, they totally do. I mean, Darren has very specific theories about when you go close and why you go close, but it's more about magnification. Basically, once you get to a certain size with somebody, you can't retreat from it because it just diffuses. I mean, that's just a general theory, which I don't disagree with. But it sometimes traps you in terms of your performance choices. If you've gotten something really golden in a medium-sized shot, and it's later in the scene, you have to find a way to justify it without it, because it does diffuse the thing, and it becomes part of the dynamics of the film overall.
Yeah.
So you often have to know the rules and then reinvent them.
Will you always kind of side with performance over any other consideration?
No, not always, but more often than not, performance is going to be king. And you always want to try and make the performance tell the right story, but there are other considerations sometimes, pace or whatever else. I mean, there are a number of things, just balance and rhythm of the thing. If it's a great performance moment that's ultimately indulgent in the film, or drags it through to a tangent you don't want, you can't have it. So there are other considerations.
Bobby, I wanted to ask you, time, date, place, February 21st, right? Is when the event takes place?
At 7 p.m. It's at the French Institute, but specifically the theater is the Florence Gould Hall. And that's it's 22 East 60th in Manhattan. That's right off Madison Avenue. It's a very beautiful space. I'm very excited. It's the first time we're doing the Inside the Cutting Room series there. He's our inaugural guest, and very worthy to be that. And we're really excited. We're going to do a series there now. And we have a home there, and I think it's very appropriate. I think it's a cinephile's dream, really, because they're connected to, for one thing, the BAFTA. They do screenings there, and they're very much. They have something called I think it's called Cinema Tuesdays, but they're very they're very respectful of film, and they have their own film series as well. So I feel we'll be appreciated, and it'll be a very interesting audience of really, I think, students, film professionals, and just cinema buffs. So I'm very excited.